It was me. I was the one. At the peak of what I called my spiritual clarity, my righteous power, I was the one who tore her paper face to shreds in front of hundreds of cheering, fervent eyes. I can still hear the sound, a sharp, violent rip amplified by the microphone, a sound that sliced through the thick, humid air of the Abundant Grace Tabernacle. I screamed that she was nothing but a plaster saint, a graven image, an abomination in the eyes of the one true God. And the thunder of my congregation's amens. That was the music that fueled my fury. That night I truly believed I was a warrior for the Lord. Today, at 62 years old, looking back with eyes that have seen what they've seen, I know I was just a broken, arrogant man declaring war on heaven itself. My name is Elijah Cole, or as I was known for the better part of 3 decades, Reverend Elijah Cole. I was born and raised in the heart of the Bible Belt, in a small town where faith wasn't just a part of life. It was the very air you breathed, the ground you walked on. My father was a man of stern, unbending faith, a man who saw the world in stark black and white, good and evil, saved and damned. There was no room for grey, and I, his only son, was forged in that same fire. I inherited his booming voice, his unshakable certainty, and his deep-seated suspicion of anything that wasn't written in the plainest words of our King James Bible. My life was a crusade, a mission to defend the purity of the gospel against what I saw as the slow creeping poison of superstition and idolatry. And the greatest of these idols, the most dangerous of these deceptions, was the Catholic obsession with the Virgin Mary. For me, she wasn't just an image. She was the symbol of everything I'd come to despise. She represented the quiet, simple faith of my own mother, a woman I loved but could not understand. I'd all but stopped speaking to her in her final years because of the small, humble shrine she kept in her bedroom. It was nothing grand, just a little plaster statue of the Virgin, no bigger than my hand, surrounded by flickering votive candles and a string of rosary beads worn smooth by her thumb. The scent of melting wax and whispered prayers hung in that room, a scent I came to associate with compromise, with weakness. I saw it as a betrayal of the second commandment, a direct affront to God. I would argue with her, my voice rising, quoting scripture like a weapon, while she would just look at me with a soft, sad pity in her eyes, a look that infuriated me more than any words could. She never fought back. She just prayed for me. I saw her prayers as a waste of breath on a plaster doll. My rejection wasn't just private, it was a cornerstone of my ministry. I preached against it from the pulpit, my voice echoing off the rafters. I called it the Great Deception, a pagan goddess dressed in Christian clothes. My congregation ate it up. They were good, honest people who trusted me to guide them, and I led them down a path of judgment. We saw ourselves as defenders of the faith, a holy remnant in a fallen world, and the more they applauded, the more my pride swelled. The louder their amens, the more certain I became of my own righteousness. I remember one afternoon, walking past St. James Catholic Church, the parish my mother attended, and seeing an elderly woman, Mrs. Galliano, tending to the flowers around a statue of Mary in the grotto outside. I stopped. I didn't mean to, but my feet just froze on the sidewalk. I watched her gently wipe a smudge of dirt from the statue's cheek, and a cold, hard anger rose in me. I walked over and I didn't shout. I spoke with a low, controlled fire. I told her she was bowing to stone, that her soul was in peril. She looked up at me, her hands covered in soil, and she smiled a gentle, weary smile. She said, "Reverend, you see stone. I see the mother who points me to her son." Her simple, unshakable peace was like gasoline on the fire of my pride. I told her she was deluded and walked away, my heart pounding with a victory that felt strangely, sickeningly hollow. But the breaking point, the act that would change everything, came during our annual summer revival. The tent was packed, the air thick with sweat, sawdust, and salvation. The energy was electric. I was at the height of my powers, my voice a roar that could make the canvas tremble, and I had planned a demonstration, a grand gesture to prove the power of true faith over empty superstition. Earlier that week, I had confiscated a cheap framed print of the Virgin Mary from a young woman I was counseling, a girl who had been raised Catholic. I told her it was a gateway for demons. Now I held it up for all to see. It was a simple, mass-produced image, the kind you could buy for a few dollars, her face tilted in a look of manufactured sorrow. I launched into the most blistering sermon of my life, a tirade against the sin of idol worship. I could feel the crowd leaning in, hanging on my every word. My wife, Sarah, was in the front row. I remember catching her eye for a split second, and even in the fervor of the moment, I saw a flicker of something, not doubt, but a deep, quiet worry that I chose to ignore. Then, with the sermon reaching its crescendo, I held the print high. "This," I thundered, "is just paper and ink. It has no power. It is an offense to the Almighty." And with a theatrical flourish, I tore the print from its flimsy frame. The microphone picked up the sound, that violent rip, and it echoed through the tent like a gunshot. A collective gasp was followed by a roar of approval. But I wasn't done. I threw the pieces to the floor, the torn face of the woman looking up from the dusty ground. And I stomped on them, again and again, grinding my heel into the paper, crushing the image with a contempt that felt, in that moment, like holiness itself. I sealed my performance with a triumphant prayer, thanking God for the strength to tear down idols. That night I went to bed feeling like a giant, a true champion of the faith. I had no idea I had just thrown a stone into the placid waters of heaven, and the ripples were about to come back and drown me. If this story is already speaking to you, if you feel that pull of something more, something real, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Give this video a like, and please, leave a comment below telling me what city or town you're watching from. It means the world to know where this story is finding a home in people's hearts. For a week, I walked on air. The story of my holy demolition spread through our circles like wildfire. People would stop me in the street, shake my hand, their eyes shining with admiration. They'd say, "Reverend, thank you for your courage. Thank you for taking a stand." And my pride, already a towering structure, added another flaw. I felt invincible, anointed. I was God's hammer, and I had just struck a mighty blow against the enemy. But the high, like any cheap drug, began to wear off, and what was left in its place was a strange and creeping poison. It started in my sleep. The first night, it was just a scent. I woke up in a cold sweat, the air in our bedroom thick with the cloying smell of incense and roses. I sat bolt upright, sniffing the air. Sarah was sound asleep beside me. I got up, checked the windows, all locked. The smell was only in our room, a phantom fragrance that clung to the curtains. I dismissed it, a neighbor's candle, a trick of the mind. But the next night the dream came. I was standing in my study, but it wasn't my study. The walls were stone and the air was cold. And in the center of the room was a woman, her back to me. I couldn't see her face, only that she was weeping, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it made the very air ache. And when she turned, her face was the one from the print I'd destroyed, but her eyes were weeping tears of blood that stained her simple blue cloak. I woke up with a scream lodged in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I told no one. How could I? To admit such a thing would be to admit weakness, to give the devil a foothold. This was a spiritual attack, I reasoned. The enemy was furious that I had torn down his idol, and now he was retaliating. So I did what I had always done. I fought back. I prayed harder. I fasted. I spent hours poring over scripture, looking for verses like weapons to wield against the darkness. But my prayers felt like they were hitting a brass ceiling. The silence from heaven was absolute. It was a silence I had never known. Before, when I prayed, I felt a connection, a surge of power, the comforting assurance of my own rightness. Now, there was nothing. Just the echo of my own words in a vast, empty room. The God I had served with such ferocity, the God whose battles I believed I was fighting, was nowhere to be found. And the nightmares only intensified. Night after night, the weeping woman. Night after night, the scent of roses and fire. My days became as haunted as my nights. I grew short-tempered, paranoid. I'd be driving and catch a glimpse of a woman's face in the reflection of a shop window, and my blood would run cold. I'd see a crumpled piece of paper on the sidewalk, and for a split second, I would see her torn, sorrowful eyes looking up at me. I was unraveling, and those closest to me could see it. Sarah would look at me with that same quiet worry I'd seen in her eyes at the revival, only now it was constant. She'd ask me what was wrong, and I'd snap at her, telling her to have more faith that I was under spiritual assault. My son David, a gentle soul with a faith far quieter and, I now realize, far deeper than my own, tried to talk to me. He said, "Dad, maybe you were too harsh. Maybe God is more about mercy than smashing things." I turned on him with a fury that shocked us both. I accused him of having a weak, compromised faith. I told him he sounded like his grandmother. The words were meant to wound, and they did. I saw the hurt in his eyes before he walked away, and in that moment I felt a terrible, profound loneliness. I had built a fortress of certainty around myself, and now I was its only prisoner. Then my body betrayed me. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was in my study preparing a sermon when a wave of dizziness washed over me. The room began to spin, not gently but violently, as if the floor had dropped out from under me. I grabbed for my desk to steady myself, but my hand missed. I crashed to the floor, my head striking the leg of a bookshelf. The world was a nauseating, tilting blur. Sarah found me there, unable to stand, my words slurring. The doctor called it acute labyrinthitis, a severe inner ear infection. For 2 weeks I was utterly helpless. I couldn't walk without assistance. The slightest movement of my head sent the world into a sickening spin. The thundering Reverend Elijah Cole, the man who could command a crowd of hundreds, couldn't even make it to the bathroom on his own. I was reduced to a state of complete dependency, of humiliating weakness. My pride, my physical strength, my voice, it was all gone. All I had left was the silence from God, the terrifying images in my head, and the 4 walls of my bedroom, which had become my prison. It was in that bed, staring at the ceiling in the dead of night, that the true fear set in. It wasn't a fear of demons anymore. It was the fear of being wrong. The fear that I hadn't been a warrior for God, but a fool. The fear that I hadn't been tearing down an idol, but spitting in the face of my own mother's love and perhaps the face of the Mother of God herself. The fear of dying alone in a silent, empty universe of my own making. I was at the absolute bottom, a broken man in a spinning room, with no one to call on but a God who refused to answer. If you've ever felt that kind of silence, that feeling of being completely alone in your struggle, let me know you're here by hitting that like button, and make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on, because what happened next in that room, it changed everything. The 3rd week of my illness was the worst. Outside, a thunderstorm raged, the kind that shakes the very bones of a house. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning threw stark, jagged shadows across my bedroom walls. But inside my head, the storm was worse. The spinning was relentless, a constant, nauseating vertigo that had become my entire reality. I lay in bed, a prisoner in my own body, staring into the darkness. Sarah had left a glass of water on the nightstand, but even reaching for it felt like a monumental task. I was adrift in a sea of sickness and silence, the silence from God. It was a tangible thing now, a heavy blanket that smothered every prayer before it could even form on my lips. I had spent my life shouting at God, for God, about God. Now, in my deepest need, there was only a terrifying cosmic void. I remember thinking, with a clarity that cut through the dizziness, this is it. This is hell, not fire and brimstone, but this, an eternity alone with the echo of your own pride. And then, it stopped. Just like that. The thunder didn't fade away. It was cut off mid-rumble. The rain didn't slow to a drizzle. It ceased. The world outside my window fell into a profound, unnatural silence. It was a silence deeper than the absence of noise. It was a heavy, waiting silence, thick with presence. My vertigo, for the first time in weeks, receded. The violent spinning in my head slowed to a gentle sway. Something was happening. I didn't know what, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was happening for me. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. My legs trembled as I put my feet on the floor. Bracing myself against the wall, I shuffled out of the bedroom and into the hallway, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was being drawn downstairs. I had to go. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. A soft, trembling light was leaking from under the door of my study. It wasn't the yellow of a lamp or the white of the moon. It was a color I had no name for, a living, breathing luminescence that seemed to pulse with a gentle heartbeat. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I was terrified. Every instinct I had honed over 30 years of ministry screamed that this was a demonic deception, a final assault from the enemy. But a deeper instinct, one I hadn't felt since I was a small boy listening to my mother's quiet prayers, told me I was wrong. I had to see. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was filled with the light, but the source wasn't a bulb or a flame. In the center of my study, where I had stomped that picture into the ground, the shredded pieces of paper were floating in mid-air. They hung suspended in the silent room, twisting and turning gently, like autumn leaves in a wind I couldn't feel. And as I watched, frozen in the doorway, they began to move toward each other. Slowly, gracefully, the torn edges met, knitting themselves back together with impossible precision. The rips and creases vanished, the paper becoming whole again before my eyes. The restored image hovered there for a moment, perfect and undamaged. And then it ignited. It wasn't a destructive fire of orange and red. It was a blaze of pure white gold light, a living, holy fire that consumed nothing. It gave off no heat, made no sound. It just was. A silent, impossible inferno of grace. And from the heart of that fire, she looked at me. It was her face. The face from the print, but it was alive. Her eyes. I had expected condemnation. I had expected judgment, the righteous anger of heaven, but there was none. Her eyes were filled with an ocean of sorrow, a grief so profound and so personal, it felt as if she were weeping for me and for me alone. It was the look of a mother watching her beloved child tear himself apart in a fit of rage. And beneath the sorrow, there was a love. A love so vast, so unconditional, so completely disarming that it shattered every defense I had ever built. No words were spoken, none were needed. In that silent gaze, a wave of pure understanding washed over my soul. It wasn't an accusation, it was a revelation. I saw my pride not as strength, but as a pathetic, childish fear. I saw my anger not as righteousness, but as a deep, festering wound. I saw my entire life's crusade for what it was, a war against the very tenderness and mercy that was now looking at me from a curtain of holy fire. I had torn her picture, yes, but I had been tearing at the fabric of love itself. I hadn't been defending God. I had been offending his heart. The strength left my body. I collapsed to my knees and then onto the floor, my face pressed against the hardwood. And I wept. I sobbed with an abandon I hadn't known since I was a boy. Not tears of fear or self-pity, but tears of absolute soul-crushing shame and overwhelming undeserved grace. The thundering pastor was gone. The warrior for God was gone. All that was left was a broken, weeping man on the floor of his study. Finally seeing the truth in the light of a fire that did not burn. What happens when a man like that is broken open? What do you do the morning after heaven itself has visited your study? If you want to see how this moment of grace reshaped a life built on judgment, hit that like button and make sure you've rung the notification bell, because the journey back into the light was just beginning. The first thing I remember is the dust motes dancing in the morning sun. I was on the floor of my study, my cheek pressed against the cool wood. And the room was silent, normal, terribly, maddeningly normal. There was no trace of fire, no hovering image, no scent of roses. The storm had passed. My wife Sarah found me there, assuming I'd had another dizzy spell and had fallen. She helped me to my feet, her face etched with concern, and the spinning, the vertigo was gone. Completely. I could stand steady. I could turn my head without the world collapsing into a nauseating blur. That alone should have been a miracle, a cause for celebration, but all I felt was a profound and terrifying confusion. My first coherent thought wasn't one of awe, but of desperate, grasping logic. It was the fever. The doctor had warned me about disorientation. The storm, I told myself, the lightning playing tricks on a sick mind. My entire being, the man I had been for 60 years, scrambled to build a rational wall around the memory, to file it away under hallucination. It was the only way I could continue to exist in the world I had built. For days, I clung to that explanation like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. I was a man of the word, of solid, verifiable truth. I didn't deal in apparitions and mystical lights. That was the domain of the people I had spent my life condemning. To accept what I had seen as real would be to admit that my entire worldview, my ministry, my very identity, was built on a foundation of sand. Worse, it was built on a foundation of profound error, of arrogant, blind pride. So, I fought it. I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow and false. Who was I even praying to anymore? The God of my certainty, or the God whose mother I had so viciously insulted? The silence remained, but it was different now. It wasn't an empty void. It was a waiting silence, patient, expectant. And the signs, they wouldn't leave me alone. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen, and the scent of roses was so thick, so real, I could almost taste it. Sarah was arranging a bouquet David had brought over from his garden. She smiled and said, "Aren't they beautiful? The smell fills the whole house." I just stared at her, my blood running cold. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But the shame was no coincidence. It became my constant companion, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. Every memory of my past pronouncements became a source of acute, burning agony. I'd be trying to read, and my mind would flash back to the revival tent. I could hear it again, that sharp, violent rip of the paper, amplified for all to hear. And this time, the sound physically sickened me. I could feel the crunch of the paper under my heel, and I'd have to close my eyes, my stomach churning. I remembered the smug satisfaction on my face, the roar of the crowd's amens. That sound, which had once been my validation, now sounded like the braying of fools, and I was their chief. I remembered Mrs. Galliano, her hands in the dirt, her gentle smile as I assaulted her with my self-righteous certainty. I had called her deluded. Who was the deluded one now? The woman quietly tending a garden for the mother of her Lord, or the man screaming in a tent, stomping on a picture like a petulant child? The answer was so obvious, so humiliating, it left me breathless. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The fortress of my pride had been breached, its walls were crumbling, and I was trapped in the rubble. I had to do something. I had to know. One Thursday afternoon, I found myself in my car, driving without a destination. Or maybe my soul had a destination my mind was not yet ready to admit. I found myself parked across the street from St. James Catholic Church, my mother's church. The church I had preached against, mocked, called a den of superstition. I sat there for what must have been an hour, just staring at it. At the stone grotto outside, where the statue of Mary stood, the one Mrs. Galliano had been tending. From this distance it was just a shape, stone and paint. My old self screamed at me, a frantic, dying voice in my head. "What are you doing here, Elijah? This is the enemy's camp. Drive away." This is a deception. But the memory of her eyes full of sorrow and love was stronger. I had to go closer. If you've ever felt that pull to take a step you were terrified to take, to face something that could change everything you thought you knew, let me know by hitting that like button. And please, make sure you've rung the notification bell, because what I found inside those doors wasn't what I expected at all. My legs felt like lead as I got out of the car and crossed the street. Every step was a war. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and something else, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. I walked into the grotto. Up close, the statue was old, the paint slightly chipped. Her hands were outstretched. I looked at her face, the placid, painted expression. It was nothing like the face I had seen in the fire. This was just plaster. And for a moment, a wave of relief washed over me. "See?" my old mind screamed. "It's just a doll, you had a fever dream." But then I looked down and saw a single fresh rose laid at the statue's feet, its petals still holding drops of water. Someone had been here. Someone had offered this simple gift, this quiet prayer. And the shame washed over me again, hotter than before. I had built a ministry on tearing things down. These people, the people I had despised, they just quietly built things, tended gardens, left flowers. I turned and faced the church itself. The great wooden doors looked 100 feet tall. This was the final threshold. To cross it would be an act of surrender, an admission of defeat. I put my hand on the cold iron handle, half expecting it to burn me, half expecting a bolt of lightning to strike me down. Nothing happened. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped inside. The change was immediate. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the faint, lingering ghost of incense. It was the scent from my nightmares. But here, it was peaceful. Light filtered through stained glass windows, painting the empty pews in silent, jeweled colors. It was so quiet. After a lifetime of loud sermons and boisterous worship, the profound, reverent silence of this place was overwhelming. I felt like a trespasser, a barbarian in a holy place. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. My eyes were drawn to the front, to the altar, and to a statue off to the side. It was her again, larger this time, holding the infant Jesus. I stopped in the aisle, my body frozen, my mind a battlefield. It's just stone, Elijah, graven images, the second commandment. The verses I had used as weapons my whole life rose up, a final, desperate defense. But they had no power here. All I could see was her face in the fire. All I could feel was the weight of my own sin. Slowly, as if in a trance, I walked to the front pew and sat down. And for the first time, not as a critic, not as a judge, but as a broken man, I just looked. And I listened to the silence. I don't know how long I sat there in that silent, empty church. Time seemed to have stopped. The colored light from the stained glass windows crept across the floor, marking the slow passage of the afternoon. I wasn't praying with words. My whole being was a prayer of surrender. When I finally stood up and walked out into the late afternoon sun, the world looked the same, but I was a different man. The old Elijah Cole had died on the floor of his study, and the man who walked out of St. James was a stranger to himself, a ghost in his own life. The first casualty of this new reality was my ministry. How could I stand in that pulpit again? How could I thunder against things I now knew to be holy? I couldn't. A week later, I quietly tendered my resignation to the Board of Deacons at the Abundant Grace Tabernacle. The news of my resignation hit our community like a lightning strike, and the rumors that followed were a wildfire. The first wave was one of concern, couched in pity. The Reverend's illness was worse than we thought, people would say. He's had a breakdown. We must pray for his recovery. But when I didn't recover, when I didn't return to my old self, the pity curdled into suspicion and then into open hostility. The story of what I claimed to have seen leaked out, probably through a deacon I'd confided in, and it became a weapon used against me. Former friends, People whose children I had baptized would cross the street to avoid me. The whispers followed me in the grocery store. He's been compromised, some said, deceived by a lying spirit. The most zealous of my former flock, those I had trained to be the most militant, were the most vicious. They saw my change not as a conversion, but as a demonic possession. They said I had opened a door to the enemy when I brought that idol into the revival tent, and that the devil had walked right in. My own son, David, bless his heart, tried to be a bridge. He believed me, I think, in his own quiet way, but he was caught in the middle, trying to defend a father who had become indefensible in the eyes of his community. Sarah. She stood by me. She never claimed to understand what I saw, but she saw the man who emerged from the fire. She saw the anger gone from my eyes, the harshness gone from my voice. She saw a brokenness in me that was somehow more whole than the strength I'd had before. She held my hand when the phone calls came, when old church members would call not to comfort, but to condemn, to quote scripture at me, the very same verses I had once used as a whip. Through it all, I never fought back. I never argued. When people would challenge me, their faces contorted with a righteous fury I knew so well, I would just look at them calmly and say, I can't explain it to you. I can only tell you that what I saw in my study that night was the most real experience of my entire life. My refusal to fight, my quiet certainty, infuriated them more than any argument could have. Slowly, hesitantly, I found my way back to St. James. Not as a convert, not at first, just as a seeker. I would slip into the back pew for the daily mass, an anonymous figure in the shadows. I watched the people. I saw the way an old woman's fingers traced the beads of her rosary, and I didn't see superstition. I saw my mother's hands. I saw the quiet devotion of a man lighting a candle before a statue, and I didn't see idolatry. I saw a prayer made visible, a simple, hopeful light in the darkness. The symbols I had once despised began to speak a language my heart was finally learning to understand. They weren't meant to be worshipped. They were signposts, reminders, windows into a mystery far greater than my rigid theology had ever allowed. They were a family album of faith, and the face of the mother was on every page, always pointing to her son. My public testimony came 6 months later, not in a pulpit, but in the basement of St. James during a parish potluck. The room was filled with the scent of baked ziti and coffee, the cheerful noise of a community at ease. I hadn't planned to speak. But Father Michael, the gentle, wise priest who had quietly welcomed me without a single question, opened the floor for anyone who wanted to share a word of testimony, and I felt that same pull I had felt in my house that stormy night. I knew I had to. My hands were trembling as I stood up. A hush fell over the room as people recognized me. I saw a few familiar faces from my old life in the crowd, people who had come with Catholic friends, their eyes wide with shock. My voice cracked as I began. "My name is Elijah Cole," I said, "and many of you know me as the man who used to preach hate against this very church." I took a deep breath. "I am here tonight to ask for your forgiveness. I ask forgiveness from any of you who ever heard me preach a gospel of judgment instead of a gospel of love. I ask forgiveness from Mrs. Galliano for the cruelty I showed her in her own church garden. And I ask forgiveness from heaven itself for a pride so blind it declared war on mercy." I told them everything. I spoke of my mother's shrine, of the revival tent, of the sound of tearing paper, and the feel of it under my heel. I told them of the spinning room, the silence of God, and the holy fire in my study. Tears were streaming down my face as I finished. "I stand here tonight a broken man," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I have learned that it is only in our brokenness that the light can get in. The very thing I spent my life trying to tear down, the very face I stomped into the ground, that was the thing that lifted me up. She didn't come to me with condemnation. She came to me as a mother, to find her lost, foolish, angry son. I didn't change my religion. I feel like, for the first time, I have found my faith. I have traded my pride for humility, and my certainty for a love that I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand." The silence in that room was as profound as the silence in the church upstairs. And then an old woman stood up. It was Mrs. Galliano. She walked over to me, her eyes shining with tears, and she simply wrapped her arms around me in a hug that smelled of garden soil and grace. This journey from hate to mercy is a journey we are all invited to take in our own way. It's the journey from a closed fist to an open hand. If this story has touched a place in your own heart, a place that longs for that same mercy, please let me know by hitting that like button. It helps this story reach others who might be lost in their own spinning rooms. And please, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. I want to hear your story. Share in the comments a moment when grace surprised you, when a love you didn't deserve found you anyway. Your testimony matters. It is a light in the darkness for someone else. Thank you for walking this path with me.